The Day of the Dragon by Sarah Davy. Oh why did George always feel so different? He never seemed to want to do what everyone else did or wanted him to do. For example, I'll tell you of the magical day little George and his family went to the beach with their family friends. George just really didn't want to go. He had devised an amazing game in the garden with his cars, his make-believe men, and a pile of stones and mud. But his mum called with great enthusiasm, saying that they were all going to the beach to meet their friends and their 2 children, Erica and the very annoying William. Why was William so unbelievably maddening? It was because every game they had ever played with him was done on his terms. Poor George and his brother Harry never had a say in what they were going to play. If it was with their knights, William's knights always won the battles. If it was with their cars, William's cars always had to be the fastest. If they were playing monsters, William had to be the biggest, scariest and ugliest monster on the whole planet. So naturally, the thought of disrupting this tremendous game of plastic men getting flattened in the mud by all George's cars in the garden filled him with absolute fury. With a heavy heart, George hid away his game behind the shed to continue later, and he trudged slowly and unenthusiastically up the windy garden path. As usual, the string of instructions from Mum and Dad followed. Wash your hands, go to the toilet, get your jumper, have a quick drink. Again, all of these were carried out equally unenthusiastically by George. Yet Harry seemed to be doing them with such eagerness, with the prospects of an afternoon on the beach ahead. When they arrived at the beach, the wind was blowing, the sea was crashing, so no swimming, and William was eagerly waiting for them in the car park, poised ready with his idea of the game to follow. Harry thought the plan of building a tower from stones and knocking them down in turn, William obviously going first, was a good enough game to begin with. The grown-ups were content to lay their big patchwork blanket on the beach and catch up with talk that never engaged the minds of little boys under 10 years old. And Erica was content to get her book out and ignore both little boys and grown-ups. But something got into George, and his headstrong mind decided that he was not going to play on William's terms. So he strode off along the beach, turning over the stones with his red trainers. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, a stone drew itself to him. There was something so very different about this round, smooth pebble. He bent down to pick it up, and the smoothness of it really pleased George. It was elliptical, an unusual tawny colour, with dark chocolate-coloured swirls round it, and it so resembled an egg. But above all, the temperature of the stone was just that little bit warmer than all the other similar stones scattered on the beach. George picked up the stone, rubbed it against his face, and gently put it in his pocket. William was certainly not going to get this one for his tower. After the rest of the afternoon being spent playing on William's terms, the 2 families packed up their camp on the beach and headed off to their separate homes, promising another lovely day such as this very soon. During the drive home, George, temporarily forgetting his treasured find in his pocket, began thinking of his game back home with his men and cars in the garden. This was put to an end when his mum announced that it was straight home for a quick tea and early to bed, as it was school in the morning. Grown-ups certainly did put an end to your plans sometimes. After a quick meal of scrambled egg on toast with grated cheese and tomatoes, Harry and George were instructed to have a swift bath. What? No playing with the dinosaurs in the water? pretending they lived in an underground world? Fully grown children really didn't know to have fun sometimes. Once George was in the peace and quiet of his own bedroom, he retrieved the stone from his pocket just before Mum grabbed his trousers for the washing and placed it gently on the stool beside him. Something made him get his special furry blanket from under his pillow and wrap it round the precious object. After planning for a while the continuation of his game out in the garden with his cars, men and mud, George drifted off into a peaceful sleep. The commotion of Mum and Dad racing round in the morning getting ready for work and school woke George up, and he instantly stretched his hand out to touch his precious stone. It was still there, safely wrapped in his blanket, but something made George touch it and look at it again. It seemed to feel warmer. Or was that just because it was wrapped in his blanket? Also, there seemed to be a tiny hairline crack on the side of the stone, passing right through one of the chocolate-coloured swirls round the surface. Oh well, there was no time to look at it too thoroughly. Breakfast and getting ready for school was the most pressing thing on the agenda at the moment. Well, according to Mum and Dad. George and Harry walked to school at a much faster pace than normal because of not being able to find one of George's shoes. But eventually it turned up underneath the piles of washing that were waiting to be done after the weekend. So, charging out of the door, the boys left, and George had no more time to even give a passing thought to his treasured find by his bed. The day passed fairly uneventfully for George. Possibly because he spent considerable time thinking of his precious rock and his game awaiting him at home, rather than the exercises on time and the piece of work on thinking of adjectives that his class were asked to do. Although he could think of adjectives to describe his stone: round, curved, smooth, polished, hard, firm, rigid, interesting, variegated, distinctive. Why was it so much better doing your work when it interested you? But despite this, George was greatly relieved when it was home time and he could get back to what he wanted. After the necessary drink and snack when he got home, George raced upstairs to see his stone. Luckily, his mum had not moved it, and George gently picked it up, thinking he might polish it even more. But in picking it up, he could not fail to realize that, yes, there was a hairline crack in the stone, and yes, it seemed a bit longer. A tremendous protective instinct took over him, and he tenderly wrapped his stone up even more with his special blanket. Too concerned to just leave it by his bed, he gently tucked it under the corner of his pillow. Mum and Dad were most mystified when George suggested that he had an early night, especially when he explained that he had not been able to concentrate so well at school today due to his tiredness. But, not wanting to lose the moment of a peaceful bedtime, they gave George a big hug and a kiss and sent him off to his room. In the peace and secrecy of his own bedroom, George retrieved his precious catch. Oh yes, the hairline crack in the stone was more like a string-line crack. George wasn't sure that that was an adjective, but it sounded good. Was it his imagination? But was it trembling ever so slightly as well? The thrill and excitement of what might be happening managed to remove any thoughts of sleep from George's agenda. He lay in bed with his find, gently lying on his furry blanket, and it was perched next to him. The trembling turned into shuddering, and George got more and more excited. Time must have passed, and George had probably had a short sleep, but he was suddenly disturbed by something brushing, oh so gently, on his nose. It was now dark outside, and no movements could be heard around the house. Everyone was safely asleep in their rooms. George opened his sleepy eyes, and there before him was the tiniest creature he could possibly imagine. Was this a dream? No, he could see all his school clothes abandoned in a heap on the floor. With another rub of his eyes, George looked again. The little being had completely replaced his precious stone. Had he eaten it to start him off in life? George gently placed his right hand under the creature, cupping it so very gently. On closer examination, he could see that it was a burnt umber sort of colour, with a few red streaks in him. His head, distinctly dragon-like, had a long nose with rather larger than expected nostrils, slightly sticking proud of his snout. 2 tiny apologies for ears were positioned either side of his head. All down his back was a red streak, almost like a collection of fins. His back legs, looking so much stronger than his front ones, had 5 toes on the end. The brown toenails so beautifully formed. His front legs, or were they arms, were so much smaller and had very thin pointed fingers. The creature, no, George was now going to call him the dragon, had large trusting green eyes looking straight at him. And what was almost the greatest surprise of all was when the dragon stuck out his dark pink forked tongue and licked George on his nose. This encounter between both boy and dragon seemed to be too much for the little thing, because he curled his long tail round his body and put his head down between them and fell asleep. Of course, George now wondered what on earth to do. Should he go and tell his mum and dad about the new arrival? Should he find something for this little creature to eat? Should he just keep this whole episode a secret? Something inside him told him that he wanted to keep this whole magical experience to himself just a little bit longer. I think George thought that the entire miraculous incident might just go away if someone else knew about it. The fact that all evidence of his stone had been removed made George think that his little dragon had eaten that for sustenance. He was sure he had heard somewhere that newborn chicks eat the inside of their eggs to fortify themselves. Well, maybe newborn dragons do just that too. So, with a clear head, George tucked his little creature gently in his blanket and lay him by his pillow where he could safely see him as he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, George woke up with a jump, initially not entirely sure if all that he could remember from last night was actually a dream. But no, it certainly was real, because there beside him was the little dragon. But it was not quite as little as it had been the last night, when it was safely tucked up. It was almost twice the size it had been when George first witnessed his arrival. A hint of uncertainty burrowed itself into George's mind. But still, wanting to hang on to his secret a little longer, he decided to say nothing to the rest of his family just yet. He placed a little pot of water next to the dragon, and then went and told his mum that he was making something secret in his room for her birthday, in order to stop her going into his room during the day when he was at school. Mums did have a nasty habit of going into boys' bedrooms and tidying up the most interesting of games. So, another day at school had to be got through, with the thought of something so much more interesting on George's mind. During the maths lesson on doubling numbers, George began to think how big his dragon might get if he kept on doubling in size. Would he ever be able to get it out of his bedroom? Where would he sleep if the dragon took up the whole of his room? How much food would he need to keep such a growing body going? George himself felt almost permanently hungry, and he was certainly not growing at that pace. A certain amount of apprehension started to find a place in his mind. The end of school finally arrived with nothing of note happening to George beyond the permanent thought of his possibly enlarging dragon. With extreme haste, George bolted his drink and biscuit down when he returned home, also managing to sneak a couple from the biscuit tin up his sleeve for his new arrival. He had also saved a sausage from his school lunch to give his new friend. Making sure that Mum and Harry were both busy with something downstairs, George leapt up the stairs, 2 at a time, almost missing the top one, and so nearly crashing all the way down to the hall again. With a slightly beating heart, he cautiously opened the door of his bedroom and peered round it. Little Dragon was still there, but he was not quite so little this time. He had slightly more than doubled in size since George had left him this morning. George's concerns and mathematical calculations began to seem a reality. He gently passed the biscuits and sausage to the little creature, who took them with great enthusiasm, along with a tender rub of his head against George's hand. Little Dragon seemed to know that George was there to be his guardian. As George tried to stroke him, which was difficult due to his little spines down his back, he thought that this little creature really should have a name. Instantly Rocky came into his head, so from then on Little Dragon was to be Rocky. But still the doubt over what he should do with Rocky slightly took over the excitement and pleasure of this delightful little creature. George's mum called him down for a meal, and, with a somewhat anxious mind, he went downstairs with all sorts of thoughts going through his head. Mum, always able to notice a change in her children, asked if George was okay. With a simple reply of yes, the meal continued with a quietness that none of the family were used to. George managed to sneak a couple of roast potatoes into his pocket to take up to Rocky. How was this going to continue? Surely soon an unbelievable amount of food was going to be needed for his not-so-little roommate. Anyway, making sure that everyone was distracted, George went up to his bedroom to check on Rocky. The speed at which he gulped down the 2 roast potatoes reinforced George's multiplying anxiety. He then remembered a box of biscuits his aunt had brought back from a holiday in Cornwall that was still in his drawer, having only eaten a few of them. George wasn't so keen on almond biscuit. He quickly retrieved them, and Rocky grabbed them and devoured all the biscuits plus the cardboard packaging without a moment's hesitation. This little burst of gobbling seemed to tire the little dragon out, and he curled up again on his cosy blanket, and within a moment he was fast asleep. Mum called George down to do his reading and checked there was no homework to do. This was good timing, so George carefully shut his door and went downstairs to do what was necessary. He was trying even more especially to do things right now, as he did not want to encourage his mother's anger any more than necessary. In fact, he overheard Mum say to Dad that she was partly enjoying George being so good, but at the same time was slightly concerned that he was so. Can these grown-ups never be pleased? After much yawning and suggestions of another early night, George went upstairs, reminding his parents that he was making a secret up in his room. Rocky was still asleep when he went in. This eating really seemed to tire him out. George snuggled down next to him, and thankfully he drifted off to sleep as well. What on earth was that, pushing him in his bed? It was surely not time to get up. And oh no, had Mum or someone come into his bedroom? But no, Rocky had seemed to outgrow his blanket and was now taking over George's bed as well. George made up a little bed on the floor for himself and hoped that Rocky would now settle down again. Thankfully he did, and the next sound was Dad calling from the landing that they must all get up. George shot up and saw that Not-so-Little Dragon now totally taking up his bed, with his tail draped over the edge onto his train set. There was no time to worry over this now, with breakfast and packing bags for school. The time flew and George and Harry were off outside for the walk to school. This was now Wednesday, and the day seemed to drag even more with the growing disquiet now in George's mind. How could he possibly concentrate on multiplying numbers in 3s and 6s when this only seemed to make George's anxiety even worse? Managing to smuggle more of his lunch into his school bag again, George continued the afternoon, feeling decidedly hungry. At last it was home time, and George raced back with such a mixture of excitement and disquiet. The gingerbread man that Mum had bought for a treat was furtively sneaked into his pocket. His mum seemed most surprised that he'd eaten it so quickly. George had to pretend he was still chewing to make it look a little bit more authentic. He raced upstairs, 2 at a time, and hesitantly opened his bedroom door. And it certainly was hesitantly, because at first the door would not open. But with a little push, more firmly, he managed to get in. And to his horror, Rocky had, yes, yet again, more than doubled in size. Not only that, but several of his books on the bookshelf had gone, along with his pile of dirty socks from the weekend. And, more worrying than ever, the houseplant on his windowsill had disappeared, with only the broken red pot to show for it. What was Rocky going to consume next? This was no longer fun, and George, forgetting the food he'd stashed in his school bag, rushed downstairs to his mum. He burst into the kitchen in floods of tears. Unable to restrain this deluge of sobbing, and barely able to breathe, George had to settle for landing in his mother's arms for consolation until she had managed to calm him enough to speak to her. After hearing a mixture of garbled phrases like stone, William, bed, blanket, dragon, eating lots, bedroom, Mum had to sit George on her knee and totally calm him down to try and make sense of what he was saying. With considerable distrust of the story at first, Mum took George upstairs to try and explain or confirm his story further. Most of you can imagine how incredulous Mum was to push open this bedroom door and find such a huge creature sharing her son's room. Thankfully for Mum, who was also beginning to panic a bit about what should be done, she heard the front door open and realised Dad had returned from work a bit earlier than expected. With barely a moment to get in the front door, Dad was called upstairs in a tone that didn't allow him to question it. He was met in the bedroom by a large pair of green, trusting eyes, and 2 pairs of somewhat concerning eyes of his wife and child. Mum and George between them started to explain the whole story again to an incredulous Dad. Rocky proceeded to sit on the bed, eating another one of George's houseplants, and looking as though he was enjoying all the attention. Dad, always known for being calm and level-headed, sat down on the bed in complete, surprised silence, and Rocky placed his head on his shoulder with big, doleful eyes looking all around. After a few moments of careful thought, Dad said, "I think he needs to go back to where he came from. A dragon's life is not in the home of a little boy and his family. He should be where he belongs." But where does he belong? George and his family had certainly never seen such dragons on the beach that they had visited so often. But surely if the egg came from there must be more, and consequently more companions for this not so little creature. So the plan was formed. Dad was going to borrow Uncle Tony's trailer and early in the morning, George and his parents were going to take him back to the beach, hopefully before too many people saw him. This would involve a day off from work for Mum and Dad and an excuse for a day off from school for George. George was beginning to realise that the whole situation was getting better and better. It was with great relief that he sat back listening to the grown-ups' plan and thought to himself how pleased he was that he had shared his secret with those who would help him. So it was early to bed that night, with the alarm clock set for 3 o'clock in the morning. Dad managed to pick up the trailer without Uncle Tony asking too many questions, and it was parked up right beside their front door. George took some time going to sleep, for he was anxiously watching if Rocky should grow any more. He was sure that he was getting bigger every time he looked. Harry had now been told about the whole incident, and he too was involved in the evacuation exercise. 3 o'clock arrived with the reverberating sound of the alarm clock, and the entire family were up and ready at a surprisingly rapid rate. Mum had packed a warm drink in her usual thoughtful way, and Dad was prepared with torches and a large strap to secure Rocky into the trailer. With the trusting relationship that had developed between George and the not-so-little dragon, it was easy to get Rocky to follow George squeezing down the stairs, making sure that his tail did not drag the plant from the landing and the photos from the stairs. And they made their way to the front door. Harry and Mum were waiting with the tailgate of the trailer down, and Rocky very willingly went into it, particularly enticed by the pile of greens Mum had thoughtfully placed inside. On the quiet nighttime roads, the family quickly reached the beach. A calm wind was blowing, and the moon was almost a complete ball in the sky. The sea was at one of its furthest points out, with the waves just gently lapping on the shore before they made their way back up the beach. Rocky obligingly followed his new guardians onto the pebbled beach. But when they were in the middle of the stones, a transformation came over Rocky. Instead of his doleful green eyes trustingly looking at George, his whole body seemed to rise up in confidence as his eyes scanned the scene before him. They took in the distant water, the low cliffs with the many unexplored crevices and holes that were so difficult to reach. With a slight hesitation, he looked back at George and then ran with such speed across the beach towards the water. A cloud seemed to obscure the moon for a while, and the whole family looked on in wonder as the dragon forked off towards the distant cliffs and very quickly out of sight. A momentary tear fell from George's eyes, but then he, along with his Mum, Dad and Harry, realised they'd done the right thing. The speed and agility of his strong back legs storming down the beach made them know that Rocky was where he should be. George willingly received a comforting hug from his Mum, and they all walked back to the trailer for a welcoming hot chocolate. The Day of the Dragon was an emotional day for all the family, and they decided to celebrate it every year by going to visit the beach where Rocky found his freedom. Mum made a point of making a dragon-shaped cake to take with them, but they never saw the strange little creature ever again. George even began to think it was all a dream, but deep down he knew it was all a reality and that it was something special to share with all his family. Whenever they visited the same beach with their friends, with Eric and William, George and Harry used to suggest they played a game looking for dragon eggs. William, in his annoyingly smug way, used to pooh-pooh such a pastime. But George and his brother used to just catch each other's eye and know that the magic lives on if only you let it.